Part 9, The 10 States of God. The pages of this chapter are built around the diagram depicting the 10 states of God. This diagram has been given by Meher Baba himself. It is a gem from the fathomless treasure of his supreme gnosis. The spiritual terms of this diagram have been linked up with the most generally accepted Sufi, Vedantic, and Christian mystical equivalents. What up, Danielle? If we were to take a bird's eye view of this diagram, we should find that it depicts what is really the downward journey of the oversoul to the lowest point of de-evolution as man, and its upward journey again through the unfolding planes of consciousness, back to the original source. First, as the divinely absorbed Majzubi Camille, and culminating finally in the perfect man. Thank you for the likes. The 10 different states of God are principal stages on this journey, a journey in which unconscious God becomes conscious man in order to become conscious God. Although these states of God are depicted as apparently distinct from one another, they are in effect 10 aspects of the one God who is and will always remain one. The descent and ascent of the Oversoul is in imagination only, and with the cessation of imagination comes the realization, with full consciousness, for the individual soul that God alone exists, and that anything and everything else which appears to exist is but his shadow. Meher Baba's gnosis upholds without equivocation both the theory of identityism and the theory of Advaitism. In the chart, The 10 States of God by Meher Baba, it is made clear that it is God alone who plays the different roles, real and imaginary. The beginning is God, and the end is God. The intermediary stages cannot but be God. The spiritual dictum of Islamic theology is Huwal Awal. I'm not reading all that. He is the first, he is the last, he is the external, he is the internal. He returns to the door from which he first came out, although in his journey he went from door to door. We shall now try to describe concisely each one of these 10 states of God as explained by Meher Baba. God, state number 1, God in the beyond state. The state of God is so transcendent that nothing can really be conceived of it. It is utterly pure and immaculate and has no tinge of otherness. It is the hidden of all hidden knowledge and the internal of all internal realities. It is beyond all worlds, and so it cannot be adequately described. It is neither finite nor infinite, neither attributeless nor with attributes. In this domain, the wings of thought, inference, discrimination, and understanding are limp and useless. A quote from Hafiz: "He cannot be grasped by the mind, therefore do not exert yourself to understand him. He is free of all directions, therefore do not try to seek him anywhere." Thank you for all the likes. Meher Baba says that when one who has realized this state of God tries to describe it to others, this act results in a description not of the first, but of the second state of God, God in the beyond state. It is the eternity of all eternities, because no eternity can be conceived of to precede or to follow it. Here, all indications are blotted out, since no other thing exists that can be pointed out or referred to. This pure essence is not aware of anything, even of itself. This state has been referred to by the Sufis as Wara ul Wara, the beyond state of God. Vedanta calls it Paratpara Parabrahma. This is the state in which God is neither Nirguna, attributeless, nor Saguna, with attributes, neither Nirakar, formless, nor Sakar, with forms. Of all the principal states of God, the first and the most original state is the beyond state of God. When there were no other states of God in the beyond and the beginning of the beginning, only the most original infinite states of God, that is, God is state, prevailed as the beyond state of God. In the infinitude of his beyond state of God, only the infinity of infinitude is manifest as the unbounded, absolute, infinite divine vacuum, and all other states, attributes, and aspects of God, including infinite consciousness and infinite unconsciousness, are all latent as the nothing in the infinitude of the unbounded, absolute, infinite divine vacuum as the everything. Everything also includes the nothing. Thus, the most original beyond state of God is that state where one can only say God is eternally, and that in this most original state, God is neither infinitely nor finitely conscious or unconscious of self or of his own state of infinitude. In this state, God is also neither conscious nor unconscious of illusion or reality. State 2. God in the beyond state. We have already stated that the beyond state of God can never be adequately described. God realized beings, when they try to describe the state, succeed only in describing the beyond state of God, which is the Allah of Sufis, the Ahura Mazda of Zoroastrians, the Paramatma of Vedantists, God the Father of Christians, and the Oversoul of some philosophers. God in the beyond state is absolute, unlimited, and infinite, the one without a second. Meher Baba, while explaining this second state of God, stressed that fundamentally state 2 is no different from state 1 of God. The substates A, B, and C of state 2 of God are what creates the difference. How, when, and where the difference came into being is described as follows from the explanations of Meher Baba. At the instant, hey Grace, how's it going? At the instant when the latent, original, infinite whim of the infinite God to know himself is about to surge in the unbounded uniformity of the unbounded, absolute, infinite, divine vacuum of the most original beyond state of God, the very prospect of this infinite urge to know, prompting the eternally tranquil poise of God in the unbounded, absolute, infinite, divine vacuum becomes inconceivable. But the fact of the insurge of the infinite whim and its very inconceivability spontaneously brings into being another aspect of God's state, other than the most original beyond state of unbounded, absolute, infinite, divine vacuum, where there is neither prospect or aspect nor attribute, neither the infinite or finite consciousness nor the infinite or finite unconsciousness, and where, except for the infinity of God, which is eternally manifest, every other thing is latent, including the infinite whim and the consequent infinite urge to know. Thus, it is that the very inconceivability of the prospect of the infinite whim surging in the beyond state automatically unfolds the perspectiveness which is also latent in the infinite state, and this manifestation bestows upon the most original beyond state of God the prospect of an infinite aspect different from that of the most original and eternal state. The second state of God, accordingly, comes into being only as another infinite aspect of the most original first state. This second state of the 10 principal states of God is called the original beyond state of God. It is to be heeded well that this original second state of God, denoted in the chart as 2 and termed God in beyond state, is in no way to be taken as a state of God altogether other than the most original first state of God, denoted in the chart as 1 and termed God in beyond state. See, the only difference between state 1 and state 2 of God is that state 1 is of unbounded, absolute, infinite divine vacuum, where even the remotest prospect of the insurge of the infinite whim is inconceivable. Therefore, only at this instant, when the original infinite whim insurges in the infinitude of the God is state, could infinite God conceive the infinite original urge to know, as who am I? That is, only when the aspectless state one of God and beyond gets this aspect of state two of God and beyond, Paratpar Parabrahma thus gets the infinite aspect of Paramatma, which means oversoul. It is also to be noted very carefully that the beyond state marked in the chart as 2 is fundamentally the same as the beyond state of God marked in the chart as 1. But in the chart, these two states, state 1 and 2, are depicted separately, because even though state 2 of the beyond state is the same original state of God, yet it is not the most original state of God, which is the beyond state. This necessarily follows because God could conceive the infinite insurge of the infinite original whim and could get the infinite original impulse of the infinite original urge to know, as who am I, only in state 2, when God eternally in state 1 assumes the infinite original aspect of state 2 within his own eternal state 1, which is the most original beyond state. Hey Debbie, how's it going? To be more explicit, in both these states of God, 1 and 2, except for the eternally manifest infinitely of the internal infinitude of God as the unbounded, absolute, infinite divine vacuum, all attributes, all aspects, all states, infinite and most finite, consciousness and unconsciousness of God, including God's own infinite trio nature of power, knowledge, and bliss, and all other things, are all latent in the unbounded, absolute, infinite, divine vacuum. All this that is latent in the infinitude could only have the scope of manifestation in state 2 of God, which may be said to differ from state 1 only in this respect, of having this infinite scope of manifestation of all that is infinitely and most finitely latent as the nothing in the infinitude of God as the everything. Consequently, the infinite original whim of God, when it once surged, had the feasibility of surging only in state 2 of God. And when it surged, it did so uniformly in the infinitude of God. But when the whim surged, the insurge of this whim could never be experienced by God in his infinitely most independent beyond state. It was experienced by God eternally in the most original beyond state, only through the infinite aspect of his state 2 as God in the beyond state. Hence, the infinite insurge of the infinite original whim and its consequent infinite repercussions are in reality affected in the state 2 of God and the beyond state. At the instant when the infinite original whim surged and God had the infinite original urge to know, as who am I, the infinite uniformity of the infinite insurge of the whim spontaneously made manifest both the latent infinite consciousness and the latent infinite unconsciousness of God simultaneously in the original beyond state of God, who is nevertheless eternally in the most original beyond state. This spontaneous manifestation of the latent infinite unconsciousness and infinite unconsciousness simultaneously is beyond the grasp of human intellect or to understand and digest. It is indeed a paradox of the realm of reality, and it defeats all human understanding. How could God spontaneously his own infinite consciousness and his infinite unconsciousness simultaneously? Meher Baba, while explaining this, declared that this is a fact and it is of the realm of reality, but it can never be understood or grasped by the mind. It is only to be realized on realizing the reality. At the same time, in order that we may get at least some concept of this fact effected in reality, and that we may not take it as a mere paradoxical mystery, Meher Baba made us understand this apparent paradox through the example of a child in a mother's womb. When the mother conceives, the child is under development in the mother's womb, and as soon as the development reaches a stage when, along with other developments, the eyes of the child are fully molded, the child gains the faculties of seeing and not seeing simultaneously. Irrespective of whether the child, after birth, sees or does not see, the very fact that the eyes have been molded in the womb of his mother gives to the child the dual aspect of his own eyes. In the eyes, as soon as they are developed, the faculties of seeing and not seeing are simultaneously contained. When the child opens his eyes, he will see, and when he closes his eyes, he will not see. But the fact still holds good that no sooner were the eyes developed than there was contained in them the dual faculty of seeing and not seeing simultaneously. Similarly, with the insurge of the original infinite whim in God, both the infinite consciousness and unconsciousness latent in God were manifested simultaneously, which to the limited mind appears paradoxical. Thus God, in his most original state of the beyond, gained spontaneously through his original state of the beyond, his own infinite unconsciousness state, and his own infinitely conscious state simultaneously depicted in the chart. Consequently, on the other hand, with the spontaneous manifestation of infinite consciousness, God in his infinite unconscious beyond state eternally remains not only infinitely unconscious of his own eternal infinite existence, as in the most original beyond state of infinitude absolute, but he also eternally remains infinitely unconscious of his own begotten infinite original beyond state, shown in the chart as 2. On the other hand, simultaneously with this spontaneous manifestation of infinite consciousness, God in his infinite conscious beyond state eternally becomes not only infinitely conscious of his own eternal infinite existence, as in the most original beyond state of the infinitude absolute, but he also becomes most obviously infinitely conscious of his own begotten infinite original beyond state. In other words, only in the beyond state of God marks God spontaneously with the insurge of the infinite original whim simultaneously begets his eternal infinite unconscious state and his eternal infinite conscious state. Time for some tea. Voice is a little weird today. Powering through it. It is, I want to say, Loquat tea. It's good for the throat. I learned about it from the singer from the Mars Volta drinks it when he does shows. And so I wanted to try it out, but it's really good. Super soothing. And my throat's kind of messed up today, so it kind of works. Alright. Substate A is of God in beyond state. It's referring to this chart, but I can't really, I wish I had a better picture of it or something. Yeah, try it out. Substate A is of God in beyond state, marked as state 2. This substate A is of divine infinite unconsciousness of God's own infinite power, knowledge, and bliss. God in his substate A neither consciously experiences his own trio nature of infinite power, knowledge, or bliss, nor uses them. So I lost my bookmark. There we go. Helps me read along. Substate B is also of God in beyond state, marked as state 2. This substate B is attributeless and formless, but is of highest divine consciousness of God's own infinite trio nature of infinite power, knowledge, and bliss. God, in this substate B, consciously experiences his own infinite power, infinite knowledge, and infinite bliss, but he does not use them. He is conscious of his reality, but is unconscious of illusion. In Vedantic terminology, it is thus that the state 1 of Paratpar Parabrahma begets the state 2 of Paramatma, and in this state 2, God is Paramatma, is eternally unconscious and simultaneously eternally conscious of his own most original state of Paratpar Parabrahma. This infinite dual aspect of the Paramatma state is pointed out in the chart. It naturally follows, therefore, that the eternal unconscious state of Paramatma, marked A, in the eternal original beyond state, eternally aspires to attain the eternal conscious state of Paramatma, which is the second of the dual infinite aspects of the original beyond state, beyond God state, Paramatma. Consequently, the divine goal is that the unconscious state of God in A should attain the conscious reality of the conscious state of God in B. In short, when state A consciously realizes state B, the divine goal is attained. For state A to realize consciously state B, there is no other alternative but that state A must gradually experience transmutation into state B and eventually become state B in all respects consciously. This gradual transmutation of unconscious infinite state of God into the conscious infinite state is depicted through states 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 as different states of God in the chart of the 10 states of God. In state 8, state A of God becomes fully conscious of state B. Sorry I don't have the chart to show, but I can flash it on the screen real quick. I don't think you can really see it though. Boop. Yeah, it's not really worth it. It just shows all the states kind of following like a path, basically, from 1 to 10. And this kind of goes in circles. In this state 8, the unconscious infinite state A of God not only gains the highest divine consciousness of state B, but God becomes divinely absorbed in the reality of his own infinite conscious state, and so realizes his eternal identity with the infinite conscious of state B of God. If God, divinely absorbed, as in state 8, recovers and maintains normal consciousness of the mental, subtle, and gross spheres through his mental, subtle, and gross aspect as an embodiment of a perfect human being, then state 9, at the divine junction between states 8 and 10, is attained. After this 9th state, the 10th state of God is depicted in the chart and connected with the God state C. This 10th state of God is the state of God qualitied and manifest in the human form of a perfect master. In state 10, God consciously experiences his own trio nature of infinite power, knowledge, and bliss, and also uses them through the divine office of God, state 10, marked in the chart as C. It is also to be well noted that God in the infinite unconscious state is neither attributeless, formless, nor with attributes or form. But state B is attributeless and formless, and state C is with attributes and form. It is that highest state of man-God where God is infinitely conscious of both reality and illusion. State 3. God as emanator, sustainer, and dissolver. In this state, God brings into his play his 3 principal attributes of emanating, sustaining, and dissolving. This three-in-one state corresponds to the trinity of Vedanta, Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesh, the Sufi synonyms of which are the terms Afridgar, Paravardigar, and Fanakar. The three attributes of God are expressed through the three archangels, Israfil, Michael, and Israel. Israfil is the angel who creates life, Michael is the angel who sustains life, and Israel is the angel who destroys life. The triple attributes of state 3 of God were latent in the most original state 1 of God. Those simultaneously unfolded themselves spontaneously at the instant when the original infinite whim surged in God, and when he conceived in his state the infinite urge to know himself, who am I? At that instant of the insurge of the infinite whim, God in his state 2 gained simultaneously the infinite dual aspects of being infinitely unconscious in his first state and being infinitely conscious in his second. Some more tea. Nevertheless, the infinite original urge to know himself obviously persists still in God, which is yet infinitely unconscious of himself. The infinite urge to know himself persisting in this infinitely unconscious state of God made possible the manifestations of all the qualities and aspects of God latent as the nothing in the infinitude of the most original state of God as the everything. But all that is latent as the nothing in the everything could be possibly conceived as latent in the beyond state of God only. Wherefore, all that is latent in the beyond state of God is gradually unfolded, propelled by the infinite urge, and is spontaneously made to manifest as all that is of the nothing. Hence, the nothingness of the nothing that is manifested is the creation, and this creation springs forth out of the infinite urge to know in the infinite unconscious state of God. Consequently, it is only natural that the infinite unconscious state A of God gains the first attributes as emanator of the three infinite attributes, God the Creator, God the Preserver, and God the Dissolver or Destroyer. For God to have gained the attribute of emanator, he obviously becomes the creator of creation, as in his state 3. It then follows most naturally that when God creates, he must spontaneously also sustain what he creates. He then obviously becomes also the preserver of creation, as in his state 3. And in the very act of preserving what is created, God also simultaneously establishes the inevitable dissolution or destruction of creation. Preservation would be meaningless if dissolution or destruction were not anticipated. Accordingly, God obviously becomes also the dissolver or destroyer of creation, as in his state 3. State 3 of God is that state in which God becomes the creator and simultaneously remains the sustainer or preserver and destroyer of his own creation. At one and the same time, God thus becomes the creator, preserver, and destroyer in state 3. The infinite original whim that surged in God and the consequent infinite urge to know himself made manifest in God the infinite triple attributes of creator, preserver, and dissolver, with all the paraphernalia of the nothingness of the latent nothing. This nothingness literally is nothing, although it appears to exist through illusion, sometimes called Maya, as the creation. Meher Baba has told us that there is no creation in the literal sense of the word, that what we call creation is a manifestation of countless forms of the nothing. This nothing is really no thing, but it exists in its own field of illusion. It cannot be denied, but it is not beyond the everything. That is God. Although the everything includes the nothing never does and never can include or mean the everything. The Almighty alone is the everything, including the nothing, and before creation manifested itself, There was literally and absolutely no thing, but the Almighty has as the everything. The existence of God alone was, and all manifestations were latent therein. One eternal sound prevailed, and all musical notes were dormant therein. Only the tavern was there, no cupbearers and wine drinkers. The gross universe was out of the question. Even the angelic world was not in existence, when with the divine command, be, life smilingly sprang up. That is a poem by Munsif Asghar. The Almighty alone existed, but he was only latently conscious, and hence he did not know himself, and in the same way that consciousness was latent in him, so also creation was latent in him. The difference between the latent and manifest and creation may be compared to that between a seed and a tree. But whether seed or tree, latent or manifest, creation is always no thing, because it is the latent nothing that is manifested as the nothingness. All that is latent as the nothing in the beyond state of the infinitude of God, as the everything, is expressed and manifested through a most finite point of the infinitude of God. This point is called the creation point, or the Om point. Through this point, creation has been precipitated. The creation point was also latent in the most original state of God, in the beyond state. The process of emanating, sustaining, and dissolving, which is constantly and uniformly going on, may be illustrated by an analogy. Let us imagine that a human body is God. The human body, sleeping with eyes shut, may then be compared to the beyond state of God. The very first moment of opening the eyes may be compared to the state of God as creator. The subsequent condition of remaining awake may be compared to the state of God as sustainer, and going back to sleep again with eyes shut may be compared to the state of God as dissolver. Thus God is the creator, sustainer, and dissolver, all three in one, at one and the same time. And that was state 3. We're on to state 4 already. State 4 is God as embodied soul. And another poem by Niaz. He desired to see himself, hence he assumed to himself varied aspects involving names and forms. That's the whole poem. It's a quote, I guess. In order to understand how the infinitely unconscious state A of God becomes gradually transmuted into the infinitely conscious state B of God and attains full and infinite consciousness, Meher Baba gave the following analogy. Imagine the infinitely unconscious God, state A, before the creation came into being, as motionless infinite ocean. A puff of wind then stirred the tranquil uniformity of the ocean, and immense waves, countless drops of water, and innumerable bubbles appeared from out of the uniformity of the limitless infinite ocean. The puff of wind that set the ocean into commotion may be compared to the impulse of the infinite original urge to know, originating with the infinite original whim of God, surging in God to know himself through his infinite God state. The stir on the surface of the ocean caused by the infinite urge surcharged every drop of that infinite ocean with the infinite original urge to know itself. Thus Paramatma, in his infinitely unconscious state, a being urged to know himself, simultaneously bestirs the tranquil poise of every Atma in Paramatma with an urge to know itself. This could only be understood when Paramatma is compared to an infinite ocean and the Atmas to the drops of that infinite ocean. But it must also be well noted that every drop of the ocean, when in the ocean, is ocean itself, until the drops inherit individuality through bubble formations over the surface of the ocean. Every bubble thus formed would then bestow a separate and particular individuality upon every drop, and this created separateness would exist within the uniform indivisibility of the drops of the infinite ocean as long as these bubbles creating separateness exist. As long as the bubbles burst, the drops, which are and were already in the ocean itself, come to realize that they are and were one with the infinite ocean, and they gain this consciousness of their eternal infinity in the infinite ocean only after they first experience separateness, and then dispel the bubbles of ignorance that were instrumental in bestowing upon them the experience of their apparent separateness from their inherent indivisibility. Hey Sky, welcome. We're already up to state 4 of this 10 states of God. This is part 9 now. And they just basically, the first one was beyond state of God, where you're kind of unconscious in a way, but also conscious of everything. It's weird. And then the beyond state of God was state 2. And then 3 is like, what was it called? Oh yeah, God as the emanator, sustainer, and dissolver. So basically, actually I'll read this part again really quick because it was kind of cool, because it compares it to different religions. So we have the and that God in this state is the creator, preserver, and destroyer. So in Vedanta, you have Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, and Mahesh, the destroyer. And then in Sufism, you have Afridgar, Pravardigar, and Fanakar. And then in Christianity, you have the archangels, Israfil, who creates life, Michael, who sustains life, and Israel, who destroys life. So yeah, and now we're already on part 4, which is God as an embodied soul. And it just went over that whole ocean analogy again. Yeah, welcome. As long as the infinitely innumerable drops of the ocean do not experience apparent separateness, they fail to realize their own homogeneous and indivisible, eternal, infinite existence as ocean itself. It is only through the experience of apparent separateness that Atmas can consciously realize their indivisible oneness as Paramatma. And again, Atma means soul, and Paramatma means oversoul. In order to describe the God state 4 of God as embodied soul, let us think of one infinitely unconscious soul of the oversoul. In the beginning, the soul has no consciousness and no impressions, sanskaras. Therefore, at that stage and in that state, the soul has no gross form, gross body, subtle body, nor mental body, because the existence of these can only give existence to. All right. Sorry, I'll read it right. Therefore, at that stage in the state of the soul, Atma has no gross form, gross body, subtle body, nor mental body, because the existence of gross, subtle, and mental impressions, or sanskaras, only can give existence to gross, subtle, and mental bodies. And only the existence of those bodies can make possible the existence of gross, subtle, and mental worlds. Hence, in the beginning, the soul in God state A, being infinitely unconscious and being impressionless, has no consciousness of gross, subtle, and mental bodies, and was also unconscious of its infinite self. The soul naturally then had no experience of the gross, subtle, mental worlds, and also had no experience of the oversoul. Now this infinite, impressionless, unconscious, tranquil state of the soul reverberated with the first impulse, which we called the first urge. Simultaneously, the reverberations of the first urge to know itself, a most gross first impression emerged, objectifying the soul as the absolutely opposite and most finite counterpoint of the absolutely infinite oversoul. Let's sip here. The soul, being eternally in the Oversoul and one with the Oversoul, has also the infinite potentialities of the Oversoul, though latent in its unconscious state. Thus, the soul is also the possessor of infinite power, knowledge, and bliss. Therefore, when the impressionless infinite soul receives the very first impression, this impression could be nothing other than the most gross impression, because the soul itself, which is the possessor of infinite knowledge, tries to gain knowledge of its own self. This very conception on the part of the possessor of the infinite knowledge is infinitely crude or gross, and this infinitely crude or gross conception of the infinite soul imparted to the impressionless soul the most gross first impression. Simultaneously with the most gross first impression, the infinitely unconscious soul also gained the most finite first consciousness. With the increasing gross impressions, the consciousness evolved and the evolution of gross forms gained momentum. I feel like this is all kind of review, but I'm here for it. Consequently, the evolution of consciousness, the evolution of gross forms, and the evolution of the experiences of the gross world were all affected as the result of the first urge of God to know himself. Because of this most gross first impression of the first urge, the infinite unconscious soul gained the aspects of experience for the first time. This first experience of the infinite soul was that it experienced a contrariety in its identity with the infinite impressionless unconscious state of Paramatma, the Oversoul. The experience of contrariety affected changeableness in the eternal, indivisible stability of the infinite soul, and spontaneously there occurred a sort of eruption, disrupting the indivisible poise and unconscious tranquility of the infinite soul with a recoil or tremendous shock, which impregnated the infinite unconsciousness of the infinitely unconscious soul with the first consciousness of its apparent separateness from the indivisible state of Paramatma, Oversoul. But the soul being infinite, the first consciousness that it derived from the recoil or shock of the absolute opposite and most gross first impression of its separateness was naturally and necessarily most finite first consciousness. The first consciousness gained by the soul was obviously most finite in proportion to the experience of absolute opposites of its own original infinite state. Consequently, it then means that in the beginning, when the impressionless infinite soul was first impressioned, such first impression was an absolutely most finite gross impression. The first consciousness it derived was most finite. Naturally, at that instant, the unconsciousness of the infinite soul actually experienced a most finite first consciousness of the most gross first impression. Now, if the soul is conscious of impressions or sanskaras, then the soul must necessarily experience these impressions. And in order to experience the impressions, the consciousness of the soul must experience them through proper and suitable media. As the impressions are, so are the experience of the impressions, and likewise so are the proper media to experience the impressions. That is to say, the impressions give rise to experiences, and to experience the impressions, the use of appropriate media is essential. Therefore, as the infinite, eternal, and formless soul has now gotten the most finite first consciousness of the most gross first impression, most obviously and necessarily, his first consciousness of the soul must utilize the most finite and the most gross first medium to experience the most gross first impression. I feel like I'm reading the same thing over and over. The first medium adopted by God in his state 4, God as embodied soul, is a first form which, although it is gross, yet it is also it is so inconceivably infinitely finite that it cannot even be considered as gross. It is so very infinitely shapeless and substanceless, matterless and formless, that it cannot lead one even to imagine that it is gross. Yet this form is the very first gross form that emerges simultaneously, as if in the three prongs, as the first three of the foremost 7 gas-like forms. If a description of these first 3 gas-like forms could ever be attempted, they could only be described from the standpoint of density, the first having infinitely negligible density, then in the second stage negligible density, and in the third stage as having the first traces of density. These first 3 forms have no evolution. The next 3 forms may come within the scope of our imagination and may be described as semi-gaseous or semi-material forms. Evolution begins with the 4th gas-like form, and finally there is the 7th gas-like form of the series of 7 foremost gas-like forms, which is hydrogen, and which may be said to include the electron. So our consciousness evolved all the way from these gaseous forms. It should be noted well that the first 6 gas-like forms bear no resemblance to the various gases such as hydrogen, nitrogen, and so forth. They are much, much finer, not subtler, than those with which the scientists of the age are well conversant. I thought it just said that it was hydrogen. So this hydrogen, which may be said to include the electron. Oh, the first 6 have no resemblance, and then the 7th is hydrogen. Got it. All right, that was the 4th state of God. This is the 5th state of God. God as a soul in the state of evolution. God as embodied soul now begins to become conscious and begins to know the creation, the nothingness, although his knowing of the creation at this stage is infinitely negligible. Even this most finite consciousness and this minutest knowing, however, creates more impressions, sanskaras, that cause the drop, soul, atma, self, to leave or dissociate from the original first bubble form. Leaving the bubble is equivalent to a dropping off of or disassociating from the first form. Even after the form is dropped, the impressions gathered by the evolving consciousness of the soul do not vanish. These impressions remain associated with the evolved consciousness and cause the evolving consciousness of the soul to associate with another appropriate and superior bubble form. The soul is thus able to know or experience more of the creation through the second form. The angle of vision widens and the consciousness of knowing increases in proportion to the simultaneous evolution of form. With the evolution of growth in gross consciousness, the impressions also increase and cause the soul to assume or associate with a still more complex gross form in accordance with the impressions retained by the consciousness when the second gross form is abandoned. In this way, the evolution of consciousness progresses for ages concurrently with the evolution of forms, which help to experience and concurrently exhaust the impressions gathered until after countless changes of forms. Through more concrete and successive stages of stones, metals, plants, worms, fishes, birds, and animals, the soul takes on the human form. In other words, the cycle of evolution of consciousness of soul continues evolving further and greater consciousness with the evolution of forms of higher and higher types, while experiencing and exhausting the impressions of the dissociated forms of the next lower type. Consequently, the evolution of consciousness of souls apparently tends the soul to identify themselves with and gather varied innumerable impressions of higher and higher gross species of forms, unlimited in number in the gross world. The clean-cut major forms with which the souls associate with every leap of greater and greater consciousness are in accordance with the leaps from stone to metal, metal to plant, plant to worm, worm to fish, fish to bird, bird to animal, and ultimately the last and seventh leap is from animal to human form. It is very important to understand that the process of evolution of consciousness concerns the evolution of bubbles or forms only, and not the drops or the souls. Oh, they're comparing it to the ocean analogy. The souls remain as indivisible and infinite as the unlimited ocean, Paramatma, from the beginning until the end of evolution of consciousness, which terminates with the completion of evolution of form. Only through this evolution of form does the consciousness of ignorance or the knowing of creation increase step by step due to varied impressions, and only in the human form can the individualized soul eventually realize the oversoul or Paramatma. As the soul is infinite, the consciousness of the soul must also become infinite, and because consciousness can become infinite only in human form, the human form is therefore the final stage of evolution of form. The soul has to pass through 8,400,000 human forms after it has once commenced to reincarnate in the human form until it has attained God realization. The pre-human forms through which it has passed before it can incarnate in the human form are innumerable. Strictly speaking, there is only one form, the human form, which is latent in all of the previous forms. The mineral, the plant, and the animal forms actually contain the human form in its latent state, and this gradually and increasingly manifested until it is at last completely expressed as a human being in a human body. Before the human form becomes completely manifested in a human body, such as a man or woman, the latent human form makes a series of partial turns. In the crystalline rock state, the latent human form is completely upside down and is almost so in the plant state as well. As the forms progress or evolve, the axis of the body rotates slowly so that it becomes more and more horizontal. And when we reach higher vertebrates, we find the head rising up more and more as the axis of the body approaches the vertical. In men and women, we find the human form completely expressed and completely vertical. The details of this evolution of form are extremely complex. There are, for example, certain species of stone, metal, plant, and animal that have what Meher Baba described as a special seat in evolution. These key species of forms are mostly those that are milestones on the evolutionary road, and they mark the first and the last of a certain general class of species of forms. For example, the first species of bird form to follow the last species of fish form, and the first species of the animal form to follow the last species of the bird form have a special seat significance in evolution. Meher Baba tells us that this whole theme has been explained down to the last detail in his own book. Book referred to should not be confused with this publication. Oh, it was maybe never published. I don't know. Meher Baba tells us that this whole theme has been explained. Down to the last detail in his own book that is still to be handed over to the world. Just as there is evolution of consciousness and evolution of forms, so also there is evolution of the worlds. The evolved consciousness of the soul, identifying the soul with evolved forms, gets more and more impressioned, and in order to exhaust these impressions, it consistently finds its field of expression, and it experiences these impressions on the earth, which is also evolving concurrently with the other worlds in accordance with the progressive evolution of the entire cosmic creation. During the course of evolution of consciousness of the soul, while consciously identifying itself with varied finite gross forms, was also simultaneously, though unconsciously, identifying itself with its finite subtle form and its finite mental form, which associated with the soul in compact, homogeneous, unconscious association throughout the course of evolution of consciousness, right from the first urge. During the whole course of the evolution of consciousness, while the soul frequently and consciously dissociates itself from the finite gross forms which act as media to experience and exhaust the impressions while evolving greater and greater consciousness, the soul never disassociates itself, consciously or unconsciously, from its finite subtle form and its finite mental form. On the contrary, when the soul dissociates its identification with any one medium of finite gross form, it is the unconscious association of the soul with its subtle form that fortifies the soul. Then, without any gross medium, with finite energy, the driving force to tend the consciousness of the soul towards identifying itself with yet another form, i.e., the next medium of the next finite gross form, to experience the impressions of the last dissociated finite gross form, retained and reflected by the finite mental form of the soul, which is also in unconscious association with the soul. That was a mouthful. Just reading. Kumar, how's it going? Welcome in. It is only natural that together with the evolution of greater and greater consciousness of the soul, the evolution of the finite subtle form of the soul also takes place to fortify the soul with greater finite energy, to tend the consciousness of the more and more gross conscious soul to identify itself with higher and higher types of finite gross forms, evolved by the impressions of the last lower and infinite and finite gross form. Similarly, the evolution of the finite mental form of the soul also takes place simultaneously to accommodate, retain, and reflect the increasingly innumerable varied impressions gained and gathered by the evolution of greater and greater consciousness of the soul. Thus, it is that only in a human form are the subtle body and the mental body fully developed. Hence, the soul associating itself consciously with human form, so to speak, fully equipped with gross body, subtle body, and mental body in human form, together with full consciousness of the gross gained in the human form. Nevertheless, although the soul has gained full consciousness in human form, and so experiences the gross world, yet the gross conscious human soul is unconscious of the subtle body, and therefore cannot experience the subtle world. The gross conscious human soul is also unconscious of the mental body, and therefore cannot experience the mental world. And that was state 5. And we're on to state 6. Thanks for the likes. All right. So state 6 is God as human soul in the state of reincarnation. The most finite first impression of the first urge gave to the infinite unconsciousness of the unconscious soul the most finite first consciousness. Gradually, varied and innumerable impressions experienced through varied and innumerable gross media gained greater and greater consciousness of the finite gross world for the soul, and eventually the evolution of consciousness was complete when the consciousness of the soul identified itself with the most first human form. Therefore, the soul, having now gained full consciousness in human form, does not need any more or any other higher forms to evolve consciousness. The consciousness gradually gained in the process of evolution is full and complete in human form. And when it says gross, it just means material world or three-dimensional. Though the soul in this state has gained full and complete consciousness, it is still not conscious of its subtle and mental bodies, nor of its unlimited self as one, indivisible, eternal, and infinite. It is only fully conscious of its identity with the human form and its varied aspects of experiences of the gross world. Consequently, the soul at this stage, only fully gross conscious of the most first human gross form, and still unconscious of the subtle and mental experiences in the gross world, all of the impressions of the most last animal gross form dissociated or dropped by the consciousness of the soul in the latest stage of evolution of consciousness. When all the impressions of the most last animal gross form are exhausted through incessant experiences by the most first human gross form, then it is but natural that this most first human form is dropped or dissociated from the consciousness of the soul. This experience by the fully conscious soul is universally accepted as the death of the human being. As explained previously, although the consciousness of the soul gets dissociated from the most first human form, yet it can never get dissociated from the unconscious associations of its subtle and mental bodies. This chapter is a bit of a grind, not gonna lie. The consciousness of the soul retains and experiences the impressions of the dropped or dissociated most first human form through its subtle and mental bodies. In order to exhaust these impressions of the consciousness of the soul must necessarily associate with a gross form, and therefore it associates itself with the next human form to exhaust and experience the residual impressions of the previous human form dropped. In fact, this next human form is nothing but the consolidated mold of the past impressions retained of the previous body or human form that dissociated from the conscious soul. The association of consciousness of the soul with the next human form is universally accepted as the birth of a human being. In short, in state 6 of God is human soul. In the state of reincarnation, the soul has developed full consciousness in human form, and therefore there is no need for any further evolution of the gross form. The evolution of gross consciousness thus comes to an end with the attainment of human form, and to experience the impressions or sanskaras cultivated in the human and the subhuman forms, the soul has to incarnate again and again into the human form. The kind of human forms with which the consciousness of the soul has to associate is determined by the nature of the previous impressions of virtue or vice, happiness or misery, and so forth. While experiencing the gross world, the soul identifies itself with the gross body, which is destructible, although the soul itself is eternal. In the subhuman stage, the evolutionary process of form and consciousness is involuntary, yet sustained and continuous, with no possibility of slipping down to the lower forms of evolution. In the human stage, which marks the end of the evolution of form and the attainment of full consciousness, the spiritual progress of man through the reincarnation and realization process is voluntary, and is also absolutely free from any danger whatsoever of slipping down to a subhuman state except in flagrant misuse of the powers on the fourth plane. Once full consciousness is gained, it is gained forever and is never lost, and the evolution of consciousness is completed only when the consciousness of the soul associates itself with human form. Therefore, retrograde incarnation is an impossibility once the consciousness of the soul identifies itself with a human form. With the development of full consciousness of the gross world in the human gross body, the soul simultaneously is associated with the fully developed subtle and mental bodies. But as long as consciousness is confined to the gross world, the consciousness of the soul cannot make use of the subtle and mental bodies directly. The soul becomes conscious of these bodies and experiences the corresponding impressions of these bodies through the corresponding spheres of the subtle and mental worlds only when full consciousness, which is conscious only of the gross at this stage, turns inward towards itself, and the process of the involution of consciousness begins. This becomes possible only when the consciousness of the individualized soul becomes satiated with the incessant experiences of the varied and innumerable impressions of the material or gross life, and only when it has suffered oscillations between the opposites of pain and pleasure for what may seem interminable ages, through the unfailing chain of births and deaths in the process of reincarnation. In the stage of evolution of consciousness, the winding process of impressions is at work with a view to evolving consciousness, developing higher and higher types of gross forms. In the human stage, the fully evolved consciousness remains, but the grip of impressions begins to loosen and thin out as a result of continuous jolts experienced by the consciousness of the soul through the seemingly unending chain of births and deaths in the reincarnation process. And that was state 6. State 7. God in the state of spiritually advanced souls. So when it says God in the 10 states of God, it's just the 10 states of our own consciousness is all it's talking about. And this one is kind of where we're on the precipice of, I think, if you're with me. God in the state of spiritually advanced souls. After a long, drawn-out struggle with the life of the gross senses in the gross world, the consciousness of the soul begins to get drawn towards the self of the soul, rather than to remain focused on the gross body and its gross environment. After a number of births and deaths, the gross conscious human soul is at last inevitably drawn to embark upon the process which will lead the man ultimately to the goal of God realization in human form. The consciousness of the soul therefore begins to withdraw itself from the world of gross senses, and is now ready to undergo the process of involution. The soul is thus said to advance spiritually through the subtle and mental spheres. The subtle sphere, or the subtle world, is the domain of the first 3 planes of the involving consciousness of the soul. The 4th plane lies between the subtle sphere and the mental sphere, and the mental sphere contains the 5th and 6th planes. The 7th state of God comprises the advance by the pilgrims on the spiritual path through the subtle and mental spheres. The greater the advance, the greater the involution of consciousness. When the soul becomes conscious of the subtle sphere through the subtle body, it identifies itself with the subtle body. And when it is conscious of the mental sphere through the mental body, it identifies itself with the mental body, just as it identified itself with the gross body when it was conscious of the gross sphere through the gross body. The spiritual progress of the soul through these spheres is entirely an imagination. The pilgrim's progress in the involution of his consciousness consists in replacing one realm of imagination for a better and higher level of imagination, right from the 1st through the 6th planes of involving consciousness. In the 7th plane, the involving process is complete. Imagination comes to an end, and reality is realized and is no longer a concept. Those who enter the spiritual path and tread upon it without the help of a master to guide them very often get lost in the labyrinth of sights and illuminations, and have little or no chance of redeeming themselves from that position. They are like children who, on their way to school, get distracted by the sights and attractions of the marketplace. The enchantment on the spiritual path is so great, and the enticement so intense, that even in the earlier stages of the journey, the pilgrim has pseudo-sense of God realization from which he cannot emerge unless helped by perfect masters. Many an advanced pilgrim in the subtle sphere thinks that he has gained complete freedom from births and deaths, although this is not so. The delusion remains up to the 6th plane of involving consciousness, but it is most conspicuous between the 3rd and 4th planes. The fourth plane of consciousness is the most treacherous stage in the pilgrim's progress, because this is the stage when all the powers of the infinite energy of the subtle sphere and are under his direct command. The misuse of these powers means the downfall and disintegration of the consciousness of the soul. Though it is a fundamental fact that once consciousness is gained, it can never be lost, yet an exception to this rule can occur, but only at the fourth plane, where there is a good possibility of the consciousness gained by the soul being disintegrated. While it is never lost completely, it disintegrates as far back as the consciousness of the stone form. The whole process of evolution of consciousness then has to be repeated to regain the full consciousness and the human form. Thus, it is that from the fourth plane, the pilgrim on the spiritual path may either fall back due to the abuse of or wrong use of tajalliyat, or progress by further involution of his consciousness to fifth plane consciousness, and capture the experience of the mental sphere or the mental world. Crossing the fourth plane and stepping into the fifth would mean gaining approach to the divine gate. In the sixth plane, the pilgrim sees God face to face. This seeing is through the mental eye, when the consciousness of the soul identifies the soul with the mental body. Even when the pilgrim sees God face to face in the sixth plane of his involving consciousness, the grip of duality is not overcome, because the seer and the seen are still differentiated through the seeing. Imagination on the plane ceases as soon as the pilgrim crosses the field of illusion and enters the realm of reality in the seventh plane of completely involved consciousness, where he is absolutely free of all traces of impressions. The seventh plane consciousness is full as well as mature, and is the impressionless consciousness which identifies the soul with itself. The soul then feels and experiences consciously its eternal existence as God. The drop soul, devoid of any bubble, form of ignorance or illusion, realizes its eternal existence in the infinite ocean as the ocean itself, the Paramatma, or Oversoul. State 8. God as the divinely absorbed. This state of God signifies for the soul the end of the long evolutionary struggle, the end of the reincarnation process, and the end of the realization process through the planes. For the individual soul, there is no higher stage toward which to aspire, because it has reached the goal by becoming one with God. The God-realized pilgrim of this stage is known to the Sufi world as a majzub, and the Vedantists call him a Brahmi Bhut. The majzub has no body conscious and no consciousness of the three spheres, the gross, the subtle, and the mental. This means that in the state 8, God as majzub consciously experiences his own infinite trio nature of infinite power, knowledge, and bliss, but does not make use of these infinite aspects of his nature. In state 8, the unconscious infinite state A of God, the unconscious Paramatma, not only gains the highest divine consciousness of state B of God, the conscious Paramatma, but in this state, God becomes divinely absorbed in his reality of his own infinite conscious state, and thus realizes his eternal identity with the infinite conscious state B of God. So it's split up into part A and part B. This state 8 of God is of the highest divine consciousness, which is the Ahadiyat, or the Vidyan. All God-realized beings, the Majzub-e-Kamil, Majzub-Salik, Azad-e-Matsluk, Kutub, and Rasul, or Avatar, retire to the state B of God in the beyond after disembodiment. Meher Baba explained that such disembodied state of the perfect master is referred to by the Sufis as Halat-e-Muhammadi. The state of Muhammad is as distinguished from Mukam Muhammadi, office of Muhammad. When in a physical body, Hakakit e Muhammadi is the 10th state of God in a physical body, and the Mukam is the Vidyan Bhumika depicted in the chart as C. Ugh, that was rough. Okay. State 9, God as liberated incarnate soul. If God, divinely absorbed as in state 8, recovers and maintains normal consciousness of the mental, subtle, and gross spheres through his mental, subtle, and gross aspects, as an embodiment of a perfect human being known as Majzub, divinely absorbed, he then experiences state 9 at the divine junction between God, states 8 and 10. If the soul recovers the normal consciousness of the mental, subtle, and gross bodies and spheres, it comes out of the Majzub, crossing the Fana Fala to get the experience of the Baka Bala state. But before becoming established in Baka Bala, it may enter the state known to Sufis as Fana Ma al Baka, which the Vedantas call this. This is state 9 at the divine junction between Fanafala and Bakabala of divinity. So, again, Fanafala is when you reach God realization and you see just a vacuum, you just witness vacuum and like nothingness. And then Bakabala is where everything floods back in and you experience everything at once. The God-realized souls in a human body at this state are either the Paramansa or the Jivan Mukta. They both enjoy infinite knowledge, power, and bliss, and are conscious of the I am God state. They differ from the Majzubi Kamil, however, in that they can do become conscious of the three bodies and the three spheres, mental, subtle, and gross. While the Majzub state is a continual state of being divinely absorbed, the state of Paramansa is one of sometimes being divinely absorbed and sometimes recovering normal consciousness of one who experiences the Suluk of Sulukiyat. His conscious experience is sometimes that of I am my own God, and sometimes I am my own creature. The state of Jivan Mukta is of one who normally experiences the Suluk of Sulukyat, one who permanently established in the state of Bakabala. Both the Paramensa and Jivan Mukta differ from the Kutub in not being able to use the infinite knowledge, power, and bliss that they experience continuously. So all these words are just meaning there's like different states of being God realized and living in reality, and some of them you're conscious of the three worlds, which are the gross world, the subtle world, and the mental world. Some of them you're not, and then the perfect one is where you're conscious of all of it. No direct spiritual benefit accrues to the world from a Paramansa or Jivan Mukta. However, a Jivan Mukta toward the end of his life does make one's single soul perfect like himself, although he has no duty in the three spheres. He enjoys the Baka Bala state. Alright, we're on the last one. This is state 10. God as man-God and God-man. This is the state of God in a human body, such as a perfect master, Kutub or Sadguru. In this state, the perfect master or the man-God is divinely, unattachedly, and unlimitedly above the law of illusion that governs the cosmic creation in an infinitely systematical order. and yet he permits himself to be bound by the limitations of time, space, and causation while continually experiencing consciously his I am God state and his infinite power, knowledge, and bliss. He not only experiences these infinite attributes, but also uses these for the emancipation of other souls in the grip of ignorance who are still unconscious of their own eternal reality. This is the state of absolute perfection. Here God is with attributes and with form, saguna and sakar. According to the Sufis, the kutub connotes the highest point on the upward journey. He is the summum bonum of creation and the fairest flower of humanity. In the Majzub state, the soul enjoyed the infinite bliss of the I am God state, but the perfect master enjoys the infinite bliss of the I am God state and also the highest divine consciousness of everything is I and everything is from me. This 10th state of God in the human body is the state of Hakikat-i Muhammadi. The perfect masters, kutubs or sadgurus, and the avatar, Rasul, are all of this state. Whether God is in the state of man-God as perfect master or in the state of God-man as avatar, he is in the 10th state and functions as man-God and as a God-man from the divine office or Vidyan Bhumika. The first manifestation of God with his infinite consciousness assumed this divine office, and this office will ever continue to function eternally to radiate infinite power, knowledge, and bliss, which the perfect masters and the avatar not only eternally experience, but also use for the emancipation of all souls who are still in the grip of ignorance, trying to gain consciousness of their eternal state of oneness with the Oversoul. In other words, God in a human body will everlastingly manifest himself in all of his perfection only through his divine office. It was only through this divine office that God, as God-man, in the form of Zoroaster, Rama, Krishna, Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, and others, manifested himself and proclaimed in every cycle, age after age, that he is the Savior, the Prophet, the Messiah, the Son of God, the Avatar, the Rasul, the Buddha, and so forth. And it is only through the divine office that the 5 perfect masters, or the kutubs, or the sadgurus, function as the summum bonum of the whole cosmic creation. The Sufis call this divine office Muqam-i Muhammadi, after the name of the Prophet Muhammad, the Rasul of God, in his Hakikat-i Muhammadi. Similarly, Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, is, like Muhammad, Zoroaster, Krishna, Rama, Buddha, the God-man, while Christ, like Hakikat-i Muhammadi, is the divine state of Jesus. Okay. When we try to put together all the different stages of God in a nutshell, 5 distinct stages in the travail of the unconscious Paramatma to gain complete consciousness become conspicuous. I'm trying to put together all the different stages of God in a nutshell, 5 distinct stages in the travail of the unconscious Paramatma to gain complete consciousness become conspicuous. Okay, the first stage. Let's see. Okay, the first stage, 1. To begin with, Atma and Paramatma are both one in the infinite, indivisible oneness of reality. 2. Before the beginning of the beginning, Paramatma and all Atmas were unconscious and unimpressioned. 3. This is all the first stage, so this is a kind of a recap here. 3. In the beginning, Atma had no consciousness of the gross body, subtle body, or mental body, and therefore had no experience of the gross, subtle, or mental world. Atma was even unconscious of its own self and therefore had no experience of its own Paramatma state. This is the stage depicted as state A in the chart of the 10 states of God. The second stage, Atma gains consciousness and has impressions. At this stage, Atma is conscious of either the gross or the subtle body or the mental body and experiences either the gross world or the subtle world or the mental world, but Atma is still unconscious of its own self and therefore does not experience the Paramatma state yet. And this is in the stage as in states 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. The third stage, I don't know why they're breaking it up into 5 stages after they just broke it up into 10, but whatever, here we go. The third stage is Atma, or soul, becomes impressionless but retains full and complete consciousness. This complete consciousness is now no longer of the gross body, the subtle body, or the mental body, and therefore Atma no longer experiences the gross, subtle, or mental world. This consciousness that is retained is of the Atma's own infinite self, and therefore Atma now experiences the Paramatma state consciously and experiences the infinite power, knowledge, and bliss of the I Am God state. This is the stage noted as state 8 in the chart. The fourth stage, Atma recovers the so-called normal consciousness of the gross body, the subtle body, and the mental body, and therefore once again experiences at one and the same time the gross, subtle, and mental world. At this stage, Atma is simultaneously also conscious of its own infinite self and experiences the infinite power, infinite knowledge, and bliss of its own Paramatma, but Atma cannot use these infinite attributes, even though at this stage it is conscious of its gross, subtle, and mental bodies and experiences simultaneously the 3 worlds. This is the stage of state 9 in the chart. The fifth stage, Atma is fully and completely conscious of the gross body, the subtle body, and the mental body, and experiences the gross world and the subtle world and the mental world simultaneously, with having the highest divine consciousness of its infinite self, and also experiences and uses the infinite power, knowledge, and bliss of its own Paramatma state. This is the stage of state 10. Okay. Cool. Oh. Okay, part 10 is, I was about to stop reading, but this is, reading bedtime stories. It's, hi, how are you? This is really grindy, heady stuff about God realization. And I was going to stop there, but there's, part 10 is literally like half a page, so I might as well just finish it. And I think that's the end of the book. The rest is all supplements, and it's like thick. This is all like supplements, which I didn't realize. So yeah, we're about to finish the book right now, technically, but I don't know if I'm gonna read the supplements or not. So I'll shuffle through them and see if they're readable. All right. So conclusion, part 10. God cannot be explained. He cannot be argued about. He cannot be theorized, nor can he be discussed and understood. God can only be lived. Nevertheless, all that is said here and explained about God to appease the intellectual convulsions of the mind of man still lacks many more words and further explanations, because the truth is that the reality must be realized and the divinity of God must be attained and lived. To understand the infinite eternal reality is not the goal of individualized beings in the illusion of creation, because the reality can never be understood. It is to be realized by conscious experience. Therefore, the goal is to realize the reality and attain the I Am God state in human form. Dang. And this is my favorite artwork from the book. There's this really pretty fold out, which you can't really see very well because there's no light. Hang on. Let me try and fix that real quick. Hopefully that doesn't fall. Okay. But yeah, this shows the evolution. This is pretty much the same chart that we've been reading about. I'm just gonna kind of scan it. So this is like, I don't know if you can see that. So up here you have God in the beyond state. This is like where we start out our consciousness, and then we have the beyond state of God, which is the next one, and then we go here to the gaseous forms, and then through stone, metal, vegetable, worm and insects, fish, bird, animal, and this is our consciousness evolving all the way to human. And then we start all this reincarnations over and over and over, about 8 million of them, I believe, until you get to these more awakened states of God, which is the subtle and mental spheres. And then you finally up here, oh, that's the mental sphere. And then finally God realization is like the end of the journey, and you're kind of back to the beginning again. So yeah, I just like the artwork on this one. Looks cool. And if we're not counting the supplements, that is the whole book. I mean, we got through it. There's a lot of supplements. And then there's a lot of glossaries and stuff. But I don't know if it'd be useful to just read the supplements through. Yeah, Sky was with me this whole freaking book, and Debbie most of it too. That's freaking dope. Yeah, it's a good chart, right? So yeah, I'll kind of skim it later and decide if it's worth reading on here. I do want to just, I was challenging myself to just like finish the whole book, you know, just so that I can have done it, you know, to understand, because I've been wanting to read this book since I was like a little kid pretty much, and just never really did it because it's too heady. I don't know, it's just my ADD, I guess. But yeah, I guess that counts. I don't know, I kind of do want to read the supplements though. There's like 40 pages of them. It's a lot of oh sorry, no, there's 80 pages of it. So it might be worth reading. Yeah, there's literally more than 80 pages of it. So that's like a third of the book. I'm only here and I'm done. But yeah, I wasn't expecting it to be over right there. But anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and get off of here. It's been another perfect hour and a half. I know, right? So yeah, good night everyone. Thank you so much for being here. That last part was a grind. Thanks for the likes. Yeah, good. Thank you so much, you guys, for you two stuck with me through this whole process, which was really cool. Helped me a lot. And I'm posting these on YouTube. Probably not going to get a lot of views or anything, but I just want to have it up there for anybody that wants to hear it without having the book or whatever. So just as a resource. But yeah, all right, cool. Thank you so much, you guys. And I hope you have a great night. Peace.